Europe's digital ambitions. The EU's just revealed its vision for the continent's tech future. Fearing competition from abroad, it wants to grow its own sector, but there are concerns over just how it will protect privacy. This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nastasya Tay. Now, there's a global race for technology leadership with the United States and China out front. Europe now says it wants to catch up and reinforce its position on the digital scene. Its leaders are concerned about the reliance on foreign-owned tech companies, including Microsoft, Apple and Huawei. They say they want to develop Europe's own tech sector. Now, to do that, they've come up with a strategy that aims to find solutions that prioritise people's lives, the economy and an open society. The EU outlined its approach for data and artificial intelligence on Wednesday. The proposals seek tougher regulation of the world's biggest tech platforms and increased spending for the EU's tech sector. But critics say more needs to be done to protect private data. We'll bring in our guests in a moment, but first let's hear what the European Commission had to say.
We want to boost European artificial intelligence by attracting more than 20 billion euros per year for the next decade. Artificial intelligence is about big data. Data, and again data. And we all know that the more data we have, the smarter our algorithms. This is a very simple equation. And therefore it is so important to have access to data that are out there. This is why we want to give our businesses, but also our researchers, and the public services better access to data.
Here, Europe is not just following. There is a real potential of taking the lead. We have strength when it comes to business technology. A lot of industrial high-quality data is being produced right now. To be able to put that together, to make the most of it, that gives us a sense of urgency.
The battle for industrial data starts now, and Europe will be the main battlefield. We'll always prefer soft law and dual governance, shared governance, than, of course, regulation. But, of course, if they don't find the way to behave the way we need for our people, then we will have to regulate. And we are ready to do this, as you know, in the Digital Service Act at the end of the year.
Well, let's now bring in our guests. In Warsaw, we have Katarzyna Szymelewicz. She's president of the Panoptykon Foundation and also a board member of European Digital Rights. That's an international advocacy group. In London, we have Maria Luisa Stasi, the senior legal officer at Article 19, a human rights organisation that focuses on the freedom of expression. And in the Dutch city of Maastricht, we have Catalina Goanta. She's assistant professor in private law at Maastricht University and also co-manager of the Maastricht Law and Tech Lab. Welcome to you all, and thanks for joining us on the programme. I do want to start with what's driving this whole process. So, Catalina, let me ask you, we have seen a number of policies emerge from various different European bodies over the last few years, and it feels like there is this sense of urgency here. What's driving that?
So it's good to take a step back and consider the nature of the field that we're going to talk about today. So technological change and the way in which technological change has been advanced through research is scaring a lot of people, but it's also presenting a lot of opportunities. So there has been a lot of pressure on the European Union to really show some sort of leadership in this field and to develop rules that would combine these two or create a balancing act between the challenges and the potential of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence. So what we're seeing right now, yesterday, has been the release of 3 different papers, 3 different documents through which the European Commission is making its voice heard on what its current vision is on how to tackle this challenge.
Katarzyna, I'm going to come to you because, as we were saying, this big AI paper was released this week. And broadly, the EU doesn't really have a reputation for being a leader in AI. We've seen the US with its tech giants leading the charge, China, because the government there is pressing for technological advancement there. Is this the EU trying to catch up? I see that Chinese and US firms currently account for 86% of AI-related patents globally. So can the EU catch up?
The way I understand the vision here is not exactly to be the economy catching up with business developments behind AI, but rather a regulator, a key governing body on able to respond to risks and threats generated by AI. So if you wanted simply to speed up growth related to this technology and in that sense compete with Chinese or US-based companies, I would say that would be a failure. What we expected and what is visible in this white paper published yesterday is a different vision in having a leading role in framing development of this technology so that it benefits societies and not only businesses, and also includes problems such as environmental impact of this technology, which is very problematic.
Well, I see that the EU, I mean, this is also certainly about a regulatory framework, but they are also wanting to scale up the spending. So in 2016, the EU spent 3.2 billion euros on AI projects, and now they're saying they want to scale that up to 20 billion euros a year in AI development. Moving back to regulation, and I do want to focus on that for a little bit. Maria Luisa, the policies that we're talking about seem to reflect a kind of inherent tension, as Catalina was saying, trying to regulate the space, but also trying to grow the space. It is a really fine line to walk. Do you feel that this white paper does that?
Well, it is a difficult task for everyone to kind of combine these two objectives. I think what we have seen yesterday is a good attempt to do that. It comes from a wide public debate in the past couple of years, at least, where we as organizations, together with other civil society organizations and consumer associations, we try to convince the European Commission that human and citizens, they should have been at the center of this, so that economic and business trade-off shouldn't have been too high. And this is what it seems to be actually reflected in the paper, because it declares again and again that the kind of development that we want to see about AI, that the European Commission imagine about the AI, the artificial intelligence, it needs to be human-centric, and it needs to be grounded on the European Union values and fundamental rights. Now, of course, these declarations need to be actually implemented. So what we need is to see how this goes down in concrete application. But in principles, I think that the framework that has been shaped, the balance that has been put forward by the European Commission yesterday, it's pretty satisfying. Then, you know, I hope we're going to have the time to talk about specific cases to see what we mean. But the general framework, it is going in the right direction, I think.
Sure. Well, one of the things that is part of this framework is this policing of the development of AI. And they've said that they want to do certification of high-risk areas. So policing, transportation, healthcare. So it sounds like the EU is not necessarily concerned with what suggestions you're getting on Netflix, but it is concerned with what kind of disease you're getting diagnosed with. So, Katarzyna, I want to come to you here because I want to ask you about whether or not you feel like drawing that line between high-risk and low-risk AI, does that work?
Well, we will see whether that has any chance to work in practice. Certainly, the approach not to regulate technology in itself, but to look at how it is used by humans in specific cases is a good approach. I agree with this one, but I'm concerned that EU is not really helping us understand where the high risk occurs. So, for example, the example you just gave us with profiling internet users and showing them news on Facebook and in other platforms, that actually might pose serious risks to how we perceive the world, how much we are fed with disinformation, how much we are affected and manipulated by online platforms. So taking the easy approach and looking at certain sectors such as policing or transport or healthcare might not be enough. I would actually expect EU to demand that every implementation of AI comes with a risk assessment because we never know which particular risks might be involved. Another red line that
I'm missing in this paper is saying which implementations of AI are problematic. For example, predicting human behavior in future can be very problematic. We don't really have scientific evidence proving that this can be done right. There is huge margin of error. There is huge risk of bias here. I don't see that red line being drawn in the white paper, and I'm still waiting for that line to be drawn in EU legislation.
Catalina, I see that you agree broadly with this, and I do want to ask you about this idea of bias or discrimination, because it's really about how you train an AI to understand the data that would potentially lead to that or not. And I see that the EU is saying that they want to test and certify the data the way that they can check cosmetics, cars and toys. How would they even start to do that?
So that's a very interesting point, and I totally agree with Katarzyna. I think that there are a lot of technologies that will be posing a lot of different risks, even if they're going to be applied cross-sector. Maybe in one sector they will be low risk, in a different sector they might be high risk. I think that that's also why the white paper mentions two cumulative factors. So there is somewhat of a vision of this danger being there. The problem is that I think it's important to keep in mind that maybe one of the most criticized aspects of this white paper has been the fact that perhaps the Commission doesn't really show that it itself understands the risks that AI poses. So the examples that have really stayed with me, especially in the field of product liability, so I have a consumer protection background, that is what kind of struck me. For instance, self-driving cars, that is a very typical example. And Germany already has a law, already dealt with this particular field of regulation. However, what do we do with the profiling of citizens, where perhaps similar technologies can be deployed in different ways? And Katarzyna mentioned that predicting social outcome is actually one of the fields of AI that really we know very clearly in science that it simply just doesn't work. We cannot predict social outcome. So then the question is, how are you going to determine the accuracy of such a tool? And maybe one of the more important documents that was released yesterday, this European data strategy, actually speaks about a more important development and a more important aspect of coming up with an innovative regulatory framework, and that is changing public procurement rules. If you have public authorities, because this is also something that the Commission seems to be very much in favor of, if we are going to have these tools being purchased by public authorities, then we need new public procurement rules and new assessment mechanisms that are going to help these public officials determine what they should rely on and what they shouldn't.
Sure.
But if only it would be as easy as this, because it all starts with information literacy. So.
Indeed, but this is a hugely, hugely complex space. And I see when Ursula von der Leyen, when she became the new head of the European Commission back in November, she gave everyone a 100-day deadline to come up with a strategy on AI. Maria Luisa, that sounds like a pretty tight time frame. Has this been rushed, do you think?
Well, I think we need to consider that the discussion didn't start with the new Commission. In fact, the old Commission has been working. Well, they appointed a high-level expert working group to provide, provide some recommendations on where to go and what to do. So at the EU level, this debate didn't start 100 days ago. Having said that, yes, it might be a short time. We welcome the idea that the white paper is now under public consultation until May, so civil society and every stakeholder can actually contribute to the debate as well. There are a number of things that I agree with what has been said before that needs to be fixed. And if I can get back, for example, to the idea of high-risk AI, the definition, which is going to be definitely a key definition, I support the fact of having different criteria to identify when we have a high-risk AI application, but I think that there is another element which is completely missing, or at least it seems to be completely missing from the white paper, so this might be something to be addressed in the next days or weeks, which is what do we do with dual-use applications? So what do we do, for example, with a smart fridge that is used or misused to spy on people you live with? This seems not to be dealt with at all by the European Commission, but if you consider the amount of technologies at our disposal, and I'm talking about private users, not only public users, the possibility of dual use is very widespread, way more than it used to be 10 years ago. So I think this should be also raised.
Well, this really raises the question of privacy, essentially, right? Because that's at the heart of all of this. Katarzyna, I want to ask you about facial recognition, because I know there was a big discussion about whether or not facial recognition software would be outlawed as part of this paper, and it seems that that hasn't happened. What do you think the priority is here, and do you agree with that?
I understand the EU is reluctant to impose a generic ban on any technology, which is a clever move because such generic bans hardly ever work in practice. On the other hand, we are all waiting to see very concrete, detailed safeguards protecting citizens from abuses in most sensitive areas. The use of facial recognition technology by the police is clearly one of very sensitive areas. I wish EU could impose, if not a partial ban, at least clear safeguards for people to be protected. For example, people who protest on the streets to be protected from identification. But here we have to understand that EU competence is very limited, and we are probably going to have to wait for national level rules on how police can use such technology. So that area, I'm afraid, is quite complicated, and we won't see very clear rules in EU level legislation.
Well, it sounds like there is this level of fragmentation there. So, Catalina, let me ask you then. I mean, we are not talking just about the US or China, a single state that can have a blanket law or choose to do things one single way. We're talking about a block of states here. Is it possible? I mean, they're talking about a digital single market already, and that's already allegedly in place. Is it possible to get everyone to agree?
Yeah, so that's a very important point, and I think maybe we should perhaps mention first and foremost that this white paper was never really meant to outlaw anything, because it simply cannot do that. It doesn't have the legitimacy and the legal binding power to do so. So that's why it's going to be very interesting to follow this space and see what's going to be put into two new acts that are upcoming: the Digital Services Act that is going to be adopted later this year, or that is going to be presented as a draft, later this year, and also the Data Act that is supposed to be published next year. So these are going to be the acts where we will see exactly what member states might want to agree to and what the limit to this agreement will be. And maybe to build a little bit on also what Katarzyna was saying, and to give you the example of how the space will be quite increasingly difficult to regulate from this perspective of proportionality and the perspective of managing the sovereignty tug of war between the European Union and the member states. In the Netherlands, it was very recent, I believe it was last week or so, that a court in The Hague ruled that the government, by using a software that was supposed to detect fraud, such as tax fraud or social security fraud, was simply not allowed to be used by the government. So on the one hand, the white paper and also its more structured twin, the communication that the Commission created for a digital strategy for Europe, they really have this idea of let's have public authorities use AI, but at the same time we see already proof and we see evidence from member states that there will be problems, and if these kind of applications and these kind of deployments of AI are not going to come with very transparent procedures that will lead to really actionable remedies by people who might be really in danger of being the victims of such systems.
Sure. Well, there's been also quite a lot of criticism of the white paper about some of the things that aren't included in the paper. And I see that it notes that the volume of data, and we've been talking a lot about how data is stored and shared, that the volume of data stored across the world that would be used to train AI would most likely quadruple from the current would quadruple from the current to 175 zettabytes by 2025. I had to look up what a zettabyte is, and that's 1 trillion gigabytes. So in 5 years, we're looking at 175 trillion gigabytes of data that needs to be stored and managed and looked after. And this all takes a huge amount of hardware and energy. And I see tech energy consumption is already increasing by 9% every year. And I know this can all seem a little bit abstract, so I do want to take a look at a few figures here. Now, back in 2014, Google's search engine received nearly 47,000 global requests a second, and that actually works out to around 500 kilograms of CO2 emissions a second. Researchers also estimate that training a single AI model just to understand human language emits carbon dioxide equal to 5 times the lifetime emissions of a car in the United States. The information and communications tech sector, including data centers, is now comparable to aviation in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And now it's forecast that data centers alone could account for 10% of total electricity use within the next 5 years. So, Katarzyna, let me ask you then. I mean, there are clearly climate change implications here, and it feels like even though there is talk of data centers being carbon neutral, there's not a lot of detail about that in this white paper.
True. European Commission seems to be very optimistic about the possibility of mitigating environmental impact, and in a way, on one hand, seems to be flirting with the mainstream narrative of progress behind AI, and on the other hand, bringing its own values and concerns. But what I would actually expect is something more radical, by saying that, by asking the questioning why do we need all that data, instead of fetishizing the data and assuming that progress in data collection and analytics is necessary. We do not see this being necessary. As we discussed before, AI is a great tool for certain users, and it's not going to do much good in predicting future, in managing human behavior, in solving other societal problems. So do we really need more of this? Do we really need to generate more data? That thinking in the white paper is quite worrying. I'm not optimist regarding the possibility of mitigating environmental impact if we continue with more of the same, meaning more data, more technology, more servers.
Well, this all comes down to trust, doesn't it? Maria Luisa, let me ask you, because this is about retaining public trust, as I see it, as Europe and the public faces a fairly uncertain future and fairly scary technological advancements that people don't fully understand. So does this policy do that? Does this policy allow the public to hold on to trust as we move forward?
Well, I'm not sure if it does it. I'm sure it kind of wishes that. To build trust is an ongoing process. It cannot be done from one day to another. And it needs a number of things, a number of elements. So I think the white paper spots a few of those elements, but then it doesn't need to be, it's not a matter of stating, again, that, for example, the technology needs to be transparent, fair, open, and human-centric. It's about how do you actually implement these principles. So this is where I think the white paper is pretty generic. There is, if you read along the lines, there might be a good end to take, which is the Commission. It's kind of admitting that we do have already legislative tools that we can use to make sure that the way we deploy artificial intelligence in Europe, it actually happens in a trustworthy way, which is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation mainly, but also other instruments in consumer protection, unfair commercial practices, etc. And it seems like the Commission is recalling this and also kind of suggesting that those instruments, they've not been applied properly so far. Which is something that the judgment mentioned just a few minutes before issued by the court in The Hague a couple of weeks ago, was doing the same. It was recalling a number of basic principles in the GDPR and saying that in the specific case, the state didn't seem to have properly applied them. So I think there we are again at the beginning of a process. We're not yet at the end at all, but much counts on the way, much weight needs to be put on the way we're going to implement basic principles.
Well, it is certainly the beginning of a very long process indeed. No concrete laws until the end of the year, I understand. It's something we'll continue to watch very closely indeed. Thank you so much to all of our guests. That's Katarzyna Szymielewicz, Maria Luisa Stasi and Katalina Gołęta. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasya Tay, and the entire team here in Doha, bye for now.